All right, welcome to week 9. We are almost at the end of our course, but we do have just a few weeks left to go. This week we're going to be covering chapter 11, which focuses on a number of topics that are closely linked, but sort of different sides of the same idea. So this chapter talks about corrections, violence more generally, and then working with victims of violence. I am mostly going to let the material speak for itself this week, but the main thing I really wanted to make sure I touched on here is just highlighting the potential of this content to be really triggering for people. Whether you yourself have been a victim of some form of violence, whether you're just someone who is more sensitive, maybe you watch the news a lot and you feel like you're just constantly inundated and hearing about it more is hard. I think any of those responses to the material we're covering this week are really valid, and I wanted to make sure that folks understand that they should absolutely be taking care of themselves while they're digesting this material. If you have really specific personal situations that make this a tough week, please feel free to reach out to me. I do not need all the details of your life. That is none of my business. But if this chapter is particularly challenging to you and we need to figure out some kind of an alternate arrangement, assignment, please let me know privately via a message. In that same vein, I want to be making sure that folks are being very mindful about the way you are expressing yourselves in this week's discussion post. Kind of like when we talked about child abuse, this is an area of the field where people can come into this field with very different ideas about what this work should look like, where this work should be centered, who is and is not deserving of services. And I want people to be very mindful and careful to still be respectful, even if you find that someone is presenting an idea that you don't necessarily agree with. You are absolutely allowed to disagree with one another, and I would encourage, if you're seeing someone who is presenting a viewpoint that you don't really agree with, to find a way to engage with that. And this is a good space to share differing opinions. However, every opinion shared in this class in general, but in this discussion board specifically, should be respectful, should not make sweeping generalizations about populations of people, and should be written with the mindfulness that anyone in this class might be viewing this post. Since we're virtual, we don't see each other. We don't know people's racial backgrounds. We don't know, if folks have disabilities. We don't know if people have been victims of crime. We don't know if people have perpetrated crimes. We don't know any of that. So I need, especially this week, for people to be really mindful of what they're writing and to feel comfortable disagreeing on things, but to do that in a respectful way. If I see things that aren't rubbing me the right way, I will address that with people. And I don't anticipate that I'm going to see that from this group specifically, but transparently, I'm coming into this week. I have a lot of feelings about this topic that I'm mostly going to keep to myself, but I'm coming into this week really wanting to make sure that we are treating each other respectfully when we're dealing with pretty triggering information. So all of that aside, there are a few topics that I don't personally think the textbook gives enough attention to, and so I wanted to make sure I brought those up. I have done my best to embed some of that into the material. This is already a week where there's a lot of content. Again, it's very heavy content, so there are going to be things missing, and I will at least try to mention the things that I see missing from the text. There might not be additional information about them. In future iterations of this class, I might try to change that, but just because I'm not giving you more information on a topic doesn't mean I don't think it's important, and doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve to be there. I just want to be mindful that there's a lot here. The first piece that I found lacking from the text this week, while they do give a section to discuss hate crimes towards the LGBTQ plus community, I noticed that while they talk about homophobia, they really don't touch on transphobia, which I think is really a big miss. It doesn't take us digging into statistics to notice that this is a pervasive problem. If you're on social media or if you even sort of follow the news, you see this pop up. You see trans folks and gender nonconforming folks being the victims of violence, being killed and harmed for the way they're choosing to express who they are. And I think it's really a shame and a miss that the textbook doesn't do a better job covering that. This is an area where I haven't gathered a lot of materials together yet, so it's unfortunately largely going to be missing from this module, but I think it's at least worth mentioning, and hopefully in future editions of this textbook, they will do a better job bringing that in. The next two omissions that I noticed are sort of linked. I kind of view them through the same lens, and I'm going to handle them a little bit differently, and I will explain why. The first of those two is police brutality, and specifically, I would say, the killing and harming of racial minorities, specifically the Black community, at the hands of law enforcement. This may be touched on in the textbook, I can't quite remember, but I think when we're talking about violence, this is a type of violence that we see in the media a lot, especially I would say over the last decade, but this is not a new issue. This has been something that community has been dealing with for a long time. And while it isn't something that's covered in the textbook, I did include a few videos in the extra resources at the end. I highly encourage folks to watch those as you can. Again, please take care of yourselves. I know this is very personal to a lot of people and is still in the news all the time. So if it just feels like too much and you're not able to take more of that in, that's completely fine. There's not going to be quizzes on that. But I think it's an important thing that we're keeping in mind. The second topic in that same vein, and I understand why this wasn't in the textbook, as we are really seeing these issues come in more into the public eye. Although these are not new issues, we're really seeing it in the public eye a lot right now, and that is violence towards immigrant communities at the hands of law enforcement, specifically ICE. I made the choice not to include additional material about this in the module, and my reasoning for doing that is because my experience with the media and the amount of coverage I'm seeing about this right now, I find very emotionally overwhelming, and I imagine I'm not the only one. So while I do want to make sure we're mentioning it, making sure we're acknowledging it, I'm hesitant to show more of that content because I want to support people taking care of themselves, and I imagine that I am not the only one who feels very inundated by this really horrific, traumatizing, very upsetting material. I, again, hope that future iterations of this textbook will include focus on that. I think this is quickly becoming kind of a defining issue of our time and is absolutely something you will encounter in human services. It does not matter what part of the field you are working in, you will have clients who are not documented, who do not have, the right paperwork to be in this country. And if you are not able to work with that population from a place of empathy and from a place of wanting to support their well-being, this is a good time to dig into that a little bit and do some work there, because you are going to meet this population in your work, hands down guaranteed. So those are the big areas that I think the textbook doesn't really cover that much. And again, you'll see some of that pop up in the module. At least this time around, it's probably not going to be in there very much, but areas to think about and areas that I will plan to include more in later iterations of this class and just wasn't able to fully get around to doing this time, but did want to mention. Just one other thing I wanted to highlight, because I think the book this chapter is very theoretical. It digs a lot into cycle of violence and the different theories that we apply working with different groups in this area, which I think is great. But I did want to make sure I'm highlighting a few other ways that we can engage in this work. I think a lot of the textbooks suggest kind of the therapeutic we're doing, the therapeutic work we're doing directly with victims or perpetrators of violence, but there are sort of some other unique ways that you can engage with this field that are a little less what we might think of as like a long-term therapy, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those. The first of those, we mentioned this in, I believe, last week when we were talking about substance use, is the alternative court model. You'll see this in some cities. I don't believe this is a national model at this point, but you will see things like drug court, mental health court. I know at least Seattle has a veterans court. So you'll see these specialized courts that are really built from a place of kind of harm reduction and rehabilitation versus punishment. These are really interesting models. I highly encourage people to do some of your own research into them. I know one of our classmates did their first mini project on a community court model, which is very similar, and I highly encourage folks to look into that more, because these are really fascinating ways for people who are potentially at risk of kind of getting inundated in this system and going into a revolving door pattern where they're coming in and out of the correctional system, the legal system. And this is a really nice potential chance towards prevention. And so I really encourage folks to look into that. I personally worked in mental health court here in Seattle when I first moved here. Wasn't there for very long. I'm happy to answer questions if people have them. But again, I think they're such cool programs, and it's a really different way to work with this field than just being kind of more of a formal counselor or working, as a counselor or a therapist in the prison system. It's just a very unique take on the field. And then one other career in this field I wanted to highlight, which again I think is very interesting and does sort of tie in to something I was just talking about, is this kind of crisis team response model. I cannot remember off the top of my head if we have this here in Seattle. I believe we do, where there are teams of a law enforcement officer and then a therapist, a social worker, someone like that, who respond to these crisis calls together with the goal of de-escalating the situation and helping people get the support they need, as opposed to, again, showing up, arresting everyone and having people get into the system that way. Again, I think these are really unique models, and it's something that, at least in my head, makes so much sense, that if someone is in crisis, arresting them on the scene isn't necessarily what they need. Sometimes they need someone to help talk them down. They might be in a mental health crisis, and they might need someone who's going to pick up on that and know what that looks like. And these are great programs, and thinking outside of the box like this in this field is such a nice departure from a system that can otherwise be very rigid, and that I think deep down has a goal of rehabilitating people, but doesn't necessarily always meet that goal. I've been talking for quite a while. I appreciate folks hanging in there with me. I am going to let you get back to the rest of the material, and please let me know if you have questions about any of this. Again, concerns about engaging with any of this material, feel free to send me a message, and I will see you all in the discussion board.